Hello and welcome to Since Attlee and Churchill, the podcast about British political history since the Second World War. I'm Lee Evans, a historian of the Conservative Party.
And I'm Richard Johnson, a historian of the Labour Party and Lee's husband. In each episode, we will be chewing over delightful morsels of British political history.
March 2026 marks a 50-year anniversary of really one of the most intriguing and fascinating events in post-war British political history. It's the resignation of Harold Wilson after 13 years as leader of the Labour Party and the election to find his replacement. That event shook much of the political world 50 years ago, and so we're going to devote 2 episodes to it. This is the first of 2, in which we'll be looking at Wilson's resignation itself, why he chose to go when he did, what was the process for him going, and because of this rather unusual way in which he was neither hounded out by his own party nor defeated by the voters at the ballot box, how he orchestrated his departure from the scene in 1976. So, Richard, just to set the scene and put us in a bit of context, take us back 50 years. Harold Wilson is Prime Minister. It's been a deeply tempestuous time inside of the Labour Party. It's been a highly unpredictable time for British politics more broadly. What is it like to be in British politics at that point, and what is it like to be Harold Wilson half a century ago?
Well, it's interesting when you look back at the accounts of that time compared to the way that the history is told. So the BBC recently has done a programme on the 50th anniversary of Harold Wilson's resignation, created by Carolyn Quinn, and she has some wonderful interviewees in there. But I thought that her initial framing was all wrong. She presents Harold Wilson as sort of at this moment of calm and serenity in his leadership. But actually, things were not quite as calm as she made out. Just before Wilson announced his resignation, the government had actually suffered a defeat in the House of Commons over fiscal spending, over cuts. He had also lost one of his ministers, Joan Lester, an education minister who resigned over cuts to education. I must say Harold Wilson was rather unkind to Joan Lester. He said that he didn't need to replace her quickly because she did so little work as a minister that her own civil servants wouldn't have even realised initially that she had resigned. Rather unfair, I thought. Poor Joan. So it's not plain sailing, actually. And I think Wilson can see that the economic clouds are darkening. You've got to remember, mid-1970s, you've had the OPEC boycotts, the oil crisis, inflation is a problem. And although Wilson had been able to dampen some of those problems when he first came in as Prime Minister through his work with the trade unions and the so-called social contract, I think Wilson could recognise that things were fraying. The trade union leaders were still backing him. In fact, I think the day after he announced his resignation, rather unfortunately timed, there was a joint piece by 3 of the big trade union leaders in the newspaper saying, we must stick with Harold Wilson. But they could recognise that their own members were not being as patient as the union leadership. So this isn't to say I think that Harold Wilson was being driven out. I don't think there's any sense of that. Nor do I think it's to say that Harold Wilson was over his head in terms of crisis. He'd seen many crises throughout his times as Prime Minister. But it's not a moment of total calm and serenity, I think, is probably what I would say on that.
He was never challenged for the leadership throughout the entire 13 years that he was in charge of Labour. In spite of the fact that there were lots of people in the Labour Party who were to the left of him politically, lots of people in the Labour Party who were to the right of him, and he also couldn't naturally make an appeal to loyalty because he had not been especially loyal himself. He had resigned from Attlee's cabinet earlier in his political career. He had challenged Hugh Gaitskell for the leadership when Gaitskell was leader. And so he couldn't basically say, well, look, I was always loyal to my leaders. You must be loyal to me in turn. He had been quite disloyal to Labour leaders in the past, yet still he managed to avoid challenges to his own leadership, if not necessarily his own authority, throughout much of his time in charge of Labour, and really go at a time of, as we remember it, his own choosing. So let's turn to that question, Richard. Why did he resign? In some ways, of course, it's quite a funny question to ask, because if you were to say to somebody in almost any other profession, why did you retire? Well, of course, it's because they've been looking forward to retirement for an incredibly long time. But political power is so precarious, is so easily lost, and is seen by people who are steeped in politics as being so desirable that we always assume that you would never wish to give it up unless it was wrenched from your hands. So in 1976, Wilson announces he's going to go. Why then? What do you think was going through his mind? And can you set out some of the competing theories as to why Harold Wilson chose to go when he did?
Well, it's described as a shock resignation. And of course, it did take many by surprise. I think it took many people in the public by surprise. There were people closer to Wilson who I think weren't surprised about this really at all. I think others, perhaps the precise timing of it surprised them, but the fact of it happening didn't. I think the vast majority of people in Britain on the 16th of March, when they got up, if people had said to them, Harold Wilson is going to resign or Harold Wilson has resigned, that was not what they were expecting to hear that day, that week, that month, that year. So why did he do it? Well, there are a variety of different competing theories. So one theory is that Wilson was experiencing the onset of the dementia that would eventually overcome him in such a uh, sad and tragic end to his life. Really, the last 10 years of his life, from 1985 to 1995, Wilson is very overcome by Alzheimer's. It was a disease which had affected his mother, so something that ran the family. Wilson was a brilliant mind. I think we can say he's one of our cleverest prime ministers. He'd been a star pupil at Oxford. He'd been an academic at Oxford. He'd been the youngest member of Attlee's cabinet.
You missed out the most important part of his education, of course, at Wirral Grammar School for Boys.
Head boy at Wirral Grammar School for Boys, in a form of just one student, as far as I understand as
Yes.
well. But nonetheless, he was number one. You're right, Lee. And so I think there was a sense in the mid-70s among those who saw Wilson that he was not as sharp as he had been. Now, that still made him sharper than most, I think, but there was a sense of decline. Joe Haynes, his press secretary, said in private, "The Rolls-Royce has become an old Morris Minor." And Wilson's drinking, it is remarked upon by people close to Wilson at the time that he did have a penchant for whiskey and brandy, that pretty much every night he would drink himself into a pretty stuporific state. And he also would drink throughout the day. It's often remarked that he would drink before Prime Minister's questions. I should say that Prime Minister's questions in those days began at 3:30 rather than at 12. So it wasn't that he was. Sometimes I think when people hear that, they think he's drinking brandy at 11 o'clock in the morning. We're talking more like 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Not that I'm saying that that's something I would do, but that I think is a detail that's sometimes forgotten. This was picked up even by the press at the time. So one of the newspapers described Harold Wilson as addicted to brandy, and he got one of his supporters, Lord Goodman, very, very wealthy donor to the Labour Party, to threaten to take legal action against it, I suppose perhaps hinging on the question of whether it was an addiction or a choice. So there's that. Was he experiencing mental decline? Was the job getting too much for him from a health perspective? Joe Haynes thought that if Wilson stayed in the job much longer, it would kill him. It was just a lot of stress and pressure. The second theory, somewhat related to this, but slightly different, is that Wilson just got bored. He got fed up with it. There are a lot of elements of being a prime minister where your privacy is completely invaded. There was a lot of mockery about his wife. His children were followed by the press, adult children, that there was just a lot of speculation about his lifestyle in a way that I think that most previous prime ministers really hadn't had to contend with. There was also just a sense that being leader of the Labour Party is particularly a difficult job because you're holding together this coalition which is constantly at war with itself. And although Wilson did a very, very good job at holding the Labour Party together, the strain of that was getting too much. Bernard, who was chief policy advisor, wrote in his diaries at the time, Harold has lost the appetite for power and the will to govern. So that's another theory.
Mhm.
The third theory is that he did this for his family. His wife, Mary, did not enjoy being a prime minister's wife. She refused to move back into number 10 after the February 1974 election, and she continued to live in their rented house on Lord North Street, which admittedly is not that far. It's on the other side of Parliament. So she wasn't keen to do this. And it was said that Wilson had actually assured her in 1970 that if he had won that election in 1970, that he would be gone within 2 years. There's some dispute over that because Roy Jenkins claims that Harold Wilson had a specific date in mind, which was the 14th of June 1973, which would have made him Prime Minister for 1 day longer than Asquith, which apparently Wilson, liking numbers and records and things, found that to be an attractive date. Anyway, of course, he lost the 1970 election, but then there was a sense that he didn't want to go out having been a loser. He wanted to go out being a winner. So he had to win another election. That election, he didn't win a majority. So he had to win another election, which he did in October 74. And then once that election was in place, he sort of thought, well, I've got about 18 months or so left in the job. A fourth theory is he quit because he was ahead, and better to quit when you're ahead than behind. I said a moment ago that Wilson could see the clouds in the distance, the economic clouds, the political clouds, and rather than walk into that storm, he decided to get out while he could. It's like if you're in the eye of a storm and you're in that period of relative calm, although you can see all the winds swirling around you, and you say, right, I'm out. And did he go for that reason? Wilson gave this as the reason to his own cabinet in 1976. He said, the time to go is while they are saying, why do you go? Not when they say, why do you stay? There are a couple of other theories. There's one theory which I think is rather eccentric, which is about the security services pushing him out. I don't know why Carolyn Quinn gave that theory so much attention in her recent Radio 4 program. I think it's a rather eccentric view. And then perhaps a more eccentric in one way, but also more plausible view in another way, is that Harold Wilson knew that the mastership of University College Oxford was due up later that year, and Wilson rather fancied the idea of becoming Master of Univ. This was the college where he was a fellow, where he worked under the Master William Beveridge at the start of his academic career, and there would have been, I think, for Wilson, a nice bit of symmetry around that. As it happened, he ended up not getting the mastership anyway, but perhaps that was one additional factor on his radar.
I think it speaks to how unusual it is for a prime minister to leave in these circumstances, not being brought down by internal or external pressure, at least not irresistible internal or external pressure, that we struggle to really process quite why it is that Wilson did what he did, to either believe his own reasons, when I think that is one of the reasons why the more conspiratorial side of things about MI5, or sometimes it's said about the security services in South Africa, who are alleged to have their sights set on Wilson, or allegations that maybe his private life and alleged affairs would come out into the public domain, and so he's exiting for that reason. I think the fascination and the draw of those explanations just to speak to how unusual this is and how difficult it is, therefore, to process quite what it is that's gone on. The only thing I wanted to really add to what you offered was on the first point about people do suggest, and they do so, of course, with hindsight of knowing that he would suffer dreadfully from Alzheimer's in the 1980s until his death in 1995. People wonder whether or not he was sensing that that decline was underway. You don't necessarily have to know that you're about to have Alzheimer's to know that by the time you're at 60 and being under this enormous pressure for successive years, you mentioned them, the two general elections of 1974, the European referendum of 1975, governing with a tiny majority in a context in which you've split your own cabinet over the question of Europe. This is a difficult time.
Losing Joe Lester.
I think you could live with that. But this is a difficult time to govern. And by the time you're approaching your seventh decade, you can imagine that you are declining physically and mentally without necessarily thinking that it's the Alzheimer's that, in his case, his mother suffered from or that he would eventually suffer from as well. There can just be a sense of exhaustion, which age and sustained pressure obviously makes much worse.
It is, it is quite young, though, I suppose, in some respects. I mean, Keir Starmer currently is 3 years older than Harold Wilson when Wilson decided to retire. And I think no one looks at Keir Starmer and thinks, gosh, he's past it, he's an old man. I mean, there might be other reasons why people object to Keir Starmer, but I rarely hear his age mentioned as one of them. Of course, you look across the Atlantic and you see all these geriatrics in America, Joe Biden, Donald Trump, Nancy Pelosi, Mitch McConnell, people who were or are 2 decades older or more than Harold Wilson in very powerful positions. So I suppose people did sort of retire quite early in those days relative to now. I know preparing for this piece, Tony Benn was reflecting on having known, was talking about some of the police guards at Downing Street and how they were approaching their 50th birthdays, which meant that they were about to retire. So I guess there is a bit of a difference between now and then in terms of our expectations of longevity, but it does still feel quite young.
It's a bit like the meme that you see occasionally, right, about how you see actors from 40, 50, 60 years ago, and they might be 35, but they look about 62. Now, I think it's partly because I think now people are a bit more vain about things like, hair loss or whatever, and seek treatments for it to the extent that they can. And also, of course, the political class of that age drank a lot more, I think, than most politicians do today, smoked, almost all of them smoked, really. Of course, Wilson famed for his pipe smoking and, it's said, secret cigar smoking.
That's something. Nighttime cigar smoking. It wasn't secret. It's just something he did at the end of the day.
Yeah, but certainly there was a lot of tobacco working its way through the man, and of course that does have its effect. The point at which he does choose to go is pretty much his 60th birthday. Is there an explanation for the exact day when he chooses to go? Is his birthday basically connected?
Yeah, well, so his 60th birthday was the 11th of March, 1976. And it's said that Wilson wanted to announce his resignation on that day. However, there happened to be 2 parliamentary by-elections that day, one in the South London seat of Carshalton, and the other seat close to your heart, Lee, Wirral, where Selwyn Lloyd, the previous Speaker of the House of Commons, had resigned to take up a viscountcy, and he was replaced by a Conservative called David Hunt. So those by-elections were taking place that day. Labour lost both of them, but they were Conservative seats. But Wilson basically just thought too much would be going on that day. So he decided to give himself the weekend, and then he would announce his resignation at his next cabinet, which was due to take place on Tuesday, the 16th of March.
Whenever this is discussed, it's always talked of as being an enormous shock. And I think it is true that for most people, like you said at the outset, if you were sat there having your cornflakes in the morning, most people would never have predicted that the Prime Minister was going to resign that very day. And for example, the Conservative Party was clearly not aware of this. So Margaret Thatcher was giving a speech to the Bow Group that morning in which she was setting out part of her vision for the Conservative Party. This was, of course, only 1 year into her 15-year leadership of the party in 1976. So that was really quite early on in setting out the foundations of what would ultimately become Thatcherism. But I doubt that she would have scheduled this speech for then if she knew the Prime Minister was going to steal all the headlines. So who did know that he was going to go?
Well, it's funny because on the one hand, this is one of the most surprising and shocking resignations, at least from the perspective of the public. But Ben Pimlott, who I think is Harold Wilson's greatest biographer, says that in some ways this is the least surprising resignation. It's the most choreographed, most staged, and longest planned resignation of pretty much any prime minister. So, as I said, Wilson was already talking about his resignation back in 1969 and 70. He said to Roy Jenkins that he was planning to go on the 14th of June 1973, which would have enabled him to beat H. Asquith's time as Prime Minister by 1 day. He apparently, after that election, while he was leader of the opposition, told various senior figures that he was only planning to do a couple of years after Labour won the next election, so that he was, he told people like Dennis Healey and Tony Benn that he would not serve a full parliament if Labour won the next election. When he appointed Bernard Donoughue to lead his policy unit, number 10, in 1974, when Labour came to power in the February 1974 election, he apparently told Bernard Donoughue that he just needed to take 2 years of leave from the LSE. So one might think that suggests that he had in his mind that he was going to be Prime Minister for 2 more years. Harold Wilson's family had been told that he was planning to do 18 months to 2 years. We happened to bump into Robin Wilson, Harold Wilson's son, in Oxford a few weeks ago, and he was reflecting on this because of the anniversary, and he also appeared in this Carolyn Quinn Radio 4 program. And Robin said, from 1970, we always knew that our father was planning to do 18 to 2 more years as Prime Minister and no more.
If I could just come in on that point, I think a little bit of context as well that we ought to put in here is that, of course, before 1970, Wilson had done 6 years as Prime Minister, and the idea that I took from what Robin Wilson said was that if he'd won that election, he would have done 18 months, 2 years, rather like you said. That would have taken him to 8 years in office. We don't necessarily think of that as being an enormously long premiership now, because since we know of the Thatcher premiership, 11.5 years, the Tony Blair premiership at 10 years. But when you think about Wilson's predecessors, Alec Douglas-Hume did a year, Macmillan did just shy of 7 years, Eden was only there for a couple of years. Churchill, of course, had led the wartime administration, but then on his own terms, basically did 4 years from 1951 to 55. If he had managed to win in 1970, do 2 years, an 8-year premiership would historically be really quite a long and remarkable time to have been in office. Certainly if at that stage he managed to do it continuously. So I think sometimes we maybe think that it's a little odd that Wilson was willing to go before he'd maybe hit this, if we look back on history, decade mark like Thatcher or Blair did, or whatever. But I think certainly the way people would have been thinking about it at the time, he already would have been one of Britain's longest serving, and we could debate, consequential prime ministers.
Yes. So I think it was widely understood by his senior MPs and a lot of the people who are in the sort of orbits around Wilson that he was going to go at some point, midway perhaps through the Parliament. Then the next level of knowledge is those who knew the precise timing, and that is a much smaller group. The Queen, Elizabeth II, was apparently told by Wilson in December of 1975 at one of their weekly meetings that he was going to go. At that time, he was planning to go on his birthday, on his 60th birthday, on the 11th of March, 1976. He also had informed his senior staff in 10 Downing Street, so that's Marcia Williams, his political secretary, who we've done an episode on, Joe Haynes, his press secretary, who I mentioned, Bernard Donoughue, his chief policy advisor, who I mentioned as well. And then when we get to March of 1976, there are a few people he tells quite shortly in advance of this. On his birthday, the 11th of March, there's a party that is thrown for him by George Weidenfeld, who's a very prominent left-wing publisher. Jim Callaghan's at the dinner, and there's a vote in the House of Commons that night. In those days, votes would take place at midnight or whatever. So Callaghan and Wilson get in a car together and go back to Parliament from the party. And in the car on the way to Parliament, Wilson tells Callaghan that the following week he's going to resign. As far as we know, that's the only member of the cabinet who is given that kind of warning, several days warning. And then just before he resigns, before the cabinet meets, Marcia Williams and or Harold Wilson may have that evening also dropped some heavy hints to a few of the guests there. So Arnold Goodman, that Labour donor and the litigious defender of the Prime Minister I mentioned earlier, Lord Goodman, he seemed to know that Wilson was going the following week. And on the Friday, so Wilson's birthday is Thursday the 11th, on the Friday the 12th, Goodman has lunch with a reporter from the Sunday Express named John Jr., and apparently drops a heavy hint that the Prime Minister's going to go the following week. The reporter goes back to his editors at the Sunday Express and says, I've been given a scoop that Wilson's going to resign next week. And apparently the editors at the Sunday Express said, this is not good enough evidence, just what some garrulous peer has told you. We've had no other indication that the Prime Minister's going. We can't run this story. And so the Sunday Express declined to run the scoop on that Sunday that Wilson was going to resign, which of course, if they had, they would have been correct and they would have had this massive scoop, but they chose not to do so. One other person who apparently knew something about the resignation was the Speaker of the House of Commons, George Thomas, who confirmed that Wilson had intimated to him that he was about to go.
It's very difficult to judge, really, because, of course, if you want to make yourself sound important after the fact, then you just go around telling people, well, of course I knew. Or, you just drop into conversation, well, Harold told me or gave the impression some time ago he was thinking of going. So I treat with a pinch of salt, really, the number of people who claim to have known afterwards. What I suspect probably happened is that they may have heard some rumours about it, but not with the strength that they were willing to say it beforehand, but where once it actually happened, they were willing to claim that they were in the loop. That would be my general suspicion. Except, of course, for the Queen or someone like Jim Callaghan, who quite clearly did know in terms from the Prime Minister's mouth. I want to come to that consequential day, the 16th of March, and how the resignation is orchestrated. Because in some ways, there's a bit of constitutional theatre that goes on. But it's really rather, in this case, theatre behind closed doors, which almost negates the point of theatre at all. And what I mean by that is that you mentioned that in the December, he informed the Queen that he would be resigning. That wasn't public, but that key conversation between the Prime Minister and the sovereign who appoints the Prime Minister had been had about his intentions. Really, the next moment in which he has to see the Queen in order to make anything official or give it effect is at the point at which he resigns as Prime Minister himself and a successor is chosen. However, what has developed as part of the theatre of British constitutional arrangements is the idea that an outgoing Prime Minister will see the monarch at the point at which they intend to resign. But of course, there is then still, and it'll be the subject of the second part of this two-part miniseries, it's the point at which they actually go that they need to see them, but instead they go and see them at the point at which they're triggering the race for their successor. When there is nothing really constitutional that has to happen, what is happening at that stage is that they are resigning as their party leader in order to trigger the race for their party's successor. Richard, can you talk us through what happens on the 16th of March itself, in particular how Wilson goes about managing that little bit of theatre that I just mentioned there, and also making it public that he is heading for the door?
Yeah, so on the Tuesday, the 16th of March, there is not a sense in the eyes of the public or the journalistic class that the Prime Minister is going to resign. It's quiet. At 10:10 in the morning, at 10 past 10 in the morning, Harold Wilson gets into his prime ministerial car and leaves Downing Street, and he's headed to Buckingham Palace. Bernard Donoughue, who is in number 10 at the time, looks out the window, sees that there's no one there. There's no journalists, there's no photographers, no one captures this moment. And you compare that to the frenzies around Downing Street on those occasions, which we've seen rather often in recent British political history, of a prime minister resigning midway through their term, and you just think of the press pack's serenity. Wilson goes to the palace. About 20 minutes later, he returns. Still no journalists, no photographers. The moment is not recorded in any image, but he has, in that meeting, as you say, Lee, he's gone to the Queen to inform her that he is resigning his position as leader of the Labour Party, and he will resign as Prime Minister at that point when the Labour Party has elected his successor. Cabinet is due to meet at 11 o'clock. At 10 to 11, he asks Ted Short, Deputy Labour leader and leader of the House of Commons, to see him in a side room. He informs Short that at Cabinet that day, he is going to announce his resignation as Labour leader, and therefore his days as Prime Minister are numbered. Ted Short was absolutely devastated. He was a Wilson loyalist. He did not get on with Jim Callaghan. And even then, it's clear that Short understands that Callaghan is the likely successor to Wilson. He could see that I think he anticipated what actually did happen, which is Callaghan sacked him from the cabinet as soon as Callaghan came in, even though he was deputy leader of the Labour Party. Got an extraordinary power play by Callaghan. People might be listening thinking, who the hell is Ted Short? Never heard of this Short fella. Well, if any of you work in politics, you've probably heard of this Short fella. At least you've heard of something tied to his name, which is short money. Short money refers to the money that opposition parties get to help them run their offices when they're not in government. And it's not short as in you fall short at an election. It's named after Ted Short because it was one of his policy achievements when he was leader of the House of Commons at that time. After telling Short, Wilson confirms to Callaghan, this is happening. What I told you in that limousine on Thursday is happening. And then he sees the Chancellor, Dennis Healey. He actually bumps into him in the toilets at Downing Street and drops this truth bomb to him. As Cabinet is then starting to sit down, words starting to percolate, Marcia Williams, Wilson's political secretary, apparently wants to get her little truth bomb dropped, and she sees Peter Shaw in the corner. It whispers in his ear, Wilson's about to resign. And Peter Shaw goes, no! Some people don't know what's going on. Other people do know what's going on. And in that moment, Cabinet is called to order. All of 23 ministers must take their seats around the Cabinet table.
You can easily imagine him having this boyish thrill almost at having the knowledge that nobody else does, and knowing he's about to create a drama, all of his own orchestration and design. You can particularly imagine the idea that he might have been stood at the urinal next to Dennis Healey and say, oh, I'll see you in Cabinet in a moment. By the way, we're about to resign. And then walking out of the room, the great sort of flair for the dramatic. You mentioned how some of the Cabinet react. What is the immediate fallout of his decision among the rest of them?
Yes, I mean, just on that point about the dramatic energy in the room, Barbara Castle writes in her diaries, quote, he certainly had developed a flair for drama. She herself was completely caught unawares. She wrote, I arrived at Cabinet all unsuspecting that Harold's time bomb was about to go off. So Cabinet begins at 11 o'clock. Prime Minister says, before we come to business, I want to make a statement. He has 8 pages of paper in front of him, and he begins to read his statement. A few minutes ago, I just returned from the palace where I saw Her Majesty the Queen, where I offered her my resignation. And there are gasps by some in the room. Wilson circulates this statement. He's signed it for each of them, perhaps as a little memento. In it, he explains his reasons for resigning, mostly those kind of reasons I mentioned related to the notion of wanting to go when he's achieved a lot and there's no sort of sense of him being pushed, that he's leaving on his own terms. He lists a lot of the achievements of his government. Barbara Castle writes this as a document of propaganda. Being a statistician, Wilson liked numbers. He informed the cabinet that he'd presided over 472 cabinet meetings, that he'd answered 1,200 parliamentary questions. This 1,200 parliamentary questions was a statistic he kept repeating in the House of Commons in the weeks ahead. He gets to the end of his statement and then silence. Ted Short, as the deputy leader, then realizes he ought to say something, and he starts to spit out some words of thanks, not very coherent. He says, "I think this is a deplorable event, and I don't know what to say, except thank you." Jim Callaghan then spoke. Callaghan is Foreign Secretary. And there he offered more polished remarks. Of course, he'd had days to prepare those remarks, unlike poor Ted Short, who was probably, his head was spinning since 10 to 11 that day when Wilson told him that he was resigning. And then Harold Wilson basically says, "I have to go. I've told you, the cabinet, but I need to tell the leaders of our movement, the trade union leaders, people like Jack Jones and Len Murray. I need to tell the NEC, the National Executive Committee, the sort of ruling body of the Labour Party. I need to tell the General Secretary of the Labour Party, Ron Hayward. I need to tell the chair of the PLP, because we need to set up the process for election." So Wilson's already got in his mind all of the different key stakeholders in the Labour Party and the trade union movement that he personally wants to tell, and he wants to tell them as soon as possible, because he knows that as soon as he's told cabinet, and once members of the cabinet get out of number 10, word's going to spread. He doesn't want them to find out by journalists. So he basically, in effect, locks the cabinet in the room. He says to Ted Short, "Ted, you take over." So Short now is in charge of chairing cabinet while Wilson goes off and has these meetings. Well, of course, Ted Short was not prepared to lead cabinet that day. So there's a bit of confusion. And Shirley Williams, who was the Price's secretary, says, "Perhaps we should use this as a moment to record our official thanks to the Prime Minister." Tony Benn thought that Shirley Williams was being very supercilious with Harold Wilson. The week before, during cabinet on Wilson's birthday, she brought in a tray of tea and said, "Oh, happy birthday, dear Harold." And Tony Benn said that just made his toes curl. But here she is again being kind of overly grateful to Wilson. But Barbara Castle says, "No, you're right. We need to draft a statement of thanks to the Prime Minister." So the two women, the only two women in the cabinet, they leave the lads in the cabinet room, and they go off to draft this letter of appreciation for Harold Wilson. And then they return, cabinet votes on it. A wise civil servant says, "Perhaps you should add somewhere that this was agreed in the Prime Minister's absence, so it doesn't look like the Prime Minister's been sort of looking over you as you write these words of thanks for him," which Barbara Castle said was actually really quite a wise move. And then cabinet wraps up. By the time the ministers leave cabinet, word is getting out there as quickly as it can with the technology of the 1970s. Harold Wilson is resigning.
The locking up of the cabinet is quite interesting, because I think you can see there the hierarchies of the British Constitution and the Labour Party trying to be welded together as well as they can be, really. Because, of course, the Constitution demands that the Queen and then the cabinet would be the first and most important people to know. But the Labour Party, and this is a factor that we've discussed occasionally in this podcast, in episodes on the 1945 election, and also most recently in our episode about Attlee and Churchill and their relationship. Part of the criticism that Churchill made is that Labour has these internal mechanisms which really try and plant the Labour Party as an institution at the apex of the Constitution, in a place where it actually doesn't very easily or comfortably sit. And it's quite interesting to see how Wilson tries to dignify the hierarchy of the Labour Party in the NEC and the trade union leaders, as you mentioned, while sticking still to what is the more traditional constitutional model here. One of the striking things about Wilson's resignation is that it does give him this time in which to orchestrate the departure, including some of the events that go with it. That is surprisingly rare, really. So I think before him, you'd have to go back to Churchill in 1955, who was being guided out by his party. In his case, the relevant age was 80, rather than 60. But he was being shown the door as delicately as his party felt that they could, or at times indelicately as it happened. He was able to set his own date and then do events preceding that. After Wilson, I think the next person to really be able to do that was Tony Blair, who again was being shunted towards the exit by members of his own parliamentary party, but did at least get to set the time scale, which meant that he could depart in a way that was of his own design. So that has a bearing then on what happens in the next sort of week or so, which I think is really worth coming on to. But the most important thing that happens really on that day, and it's really the typically standout moment of the parliamentary week, is Prime Minister's questions. And presumably, Wilson's resignation is one of the key themes on everybody's lips.
It is, and Prime Minister's questions, as I mentioned, is about 3:30 that afternoon. So if you think about it, probably word gets out about this at about 11:30, 12 o'clock. So the Conservatives have 2 or 3 hours to digest the news. Margaret Thatcher, who is now Conservative leader, leads on this sort of insistence that Wilson call for a snap general election. She says that she wants a general election 3 weeks from Thursday, is what she says. I think it's a really weird thing to call for, given that how would it be responsible for Wilson to call a general election when the leader of the government is not known at all? I don't think that was very skillful. At one point, Wilson makes some comment about my successor will, and then Tories heckle him and say, who will it be? And then Wilson replies, for a long time, we have had the practice of democratic elections, not the scatty system which the Conservative Party introduced, but for which the Right Honourable Member for Penrith and the Border, Willie Whitelaw, would have been the leader of the Conservative Party. So he's having a dig at your Conservative leadership election rules there, and praising Labour's procedures.
It's rather hard to know what Wilson really has in mind there in that attack, because the Conservative leadership rules since 1965 were for election by the parliamentary party, which were also the Labour leadership rules at the time. And in fact, what they had rather in common, and this was a very means by which Margaret Thatcher took on the leadership of the party, is that the rule book could be used to challenge sitting leaders of the Labour Party. Wilson had done that himself when Hugh Gaitskell was leader, had launched a challenge against a sitting leader. So I actually think that's a rather daft criticism from Wilson, really, as the rules are not all that dissimilar. There are some bits of the technicalities where they're different, winning thresholds and how it works, etc. But Willie Whitelaw stood for the leadership against Margaret Thatcher after Ted Heath had been defeated and resigned following the first round, and she won. In fact, she won with a majority of the vote. So it's a really rather odd criticism, I think, of Wilson's to make, but that's a by the by.
Perhaps you're right, but anyway, he then he also received praise from the other side of the House. Enoch Powell, who is now a Ulster Unionist MP, praises Harold Wilson for his record on Northern Ireland and compares the Labour government's record on Northern Ireland much more favourably than the Conservatives' record on Northern Ireland, which is quite interesting. And then Edward Heath, the former Conservative Prime Minister, ousted by Margaret Thatcher the previous year, makes a surprisingly gracious intervention in PMQs.
Here's what he said. As the Prime Minister and I faced each other across the table for 10 years of our leadership of our respective parties, may I say that any man who has been able to lead his party as skillfully as he has for 13 years and been Prime Minister for 8 years, having won 4 general elections, deserves the fullest tributes from his achievements during that time. May I thank the right honourable gentleman for the courtesies that he has always extended to me when I was leader of the opposition, and for the way that he responded to my invitations during the time that I was Prime Minister. May I congratulate him, after his retirement from office, on joining the party which is the only one to have doubled in numbers in the course of a year.
Which is obviously a reference to the ex-Prime Minister's party. Although I think Wilson didn't quite grasp that, because then Wilson says, well, I'm not sure that the party's membership has increased in those numbers. And then Ted Heath then has to clarify and say, I meant our parliamentary party. And then Wilson doesn't seem to quite catch on to that either.
It's not a very obvious joke from Heath, I would say. I mean, as I read that for the first time, I didn't entirely know what it was that he was getting at. It's interesting, of course, because their relationship is remembered for its bitterness in large part. But of course, as is so very often the case, it's the moment at which somebody ceases to be a threat that they really end up feeling much more generously towards them and see the common travails and experiences that they've been through together and in opposition to each other in a much more generous light than when they're actually in that political scrap day to day themselves. So it's a very nice comment from Heath, but it comes at a time at which it's really rather easy for him to make a nice comment.
But what I would say, and again, not to criticize the Carolyn Quinn documentary on Radio 4 too much, but there's some comments someone makes in it about how Wilson had absolutely no time for Edward Heath. And obviously they were quite acrimonious when they were leaders, but you're right. I think when they are both former prime ministers, they are much more courteous to each other. And it says something about Heath's character, and there's not much to be said about it, but there is something to be said that as Harold Wilson continued to decline in his mental agility, Ted Heath would spend time with Mary Wilson and invited Mary Wilson, I believe, to stay at his house, Arundel's in Salisbury, either while Harold Wilson was quite ill or shortly after his death, which, again, feels a little bit of out of character there, but I think shows that there's complexity to this Heath-Wilson relationship more than is sometimes described. And then after PMQs, immediately after PMQs, Harold Wilson then gives a great big press conference where he answers questions about his resignation. It's not particularly notable, except for the fact that Harold Wilson, perhaps echoing something of Edward Heath's generosity, tells the press that he forgives them for all their sins.
I agree with you that Thatcher's suggestion of an election in 3 weeks' time is odd and would not be practical. The idea that when there's a change in prime minister, an election should follow is always a really easy thing for leaders of the opposition to call for. But of course, it very rarely happens. It's not really proper that it would necessarily. Some people suggest that now we're such a presidentialized system that mandates are attached to party leaders more than the parties themselves. I think that's a pretty dangerous idea to indulge in, though, really. And I suspect in years to come, she would regret having made that suggestion of an election. It's also just worth giving a bit of context that this is very early in Margaret Thatcher's leadership, where there are great doubts about her ability to lead the party, and certainly about whether she'll ever lead the country. In years to come, it'll seem as if she was the unavoidable prime minister and then the immovable prime minister, as successive Labour leaders and even some internal critics within the party struggled to dislodge her from power. But at the time, few people imagined she was the next prime minister of the country, and she was not really finding her feet in the House of Commons. Richard, to begin to wrap this first episode up on Wilson's departure, there are a couple of dinners that I wanted to turn to. There's one of the cabinet, which is perhaps not altogether surprising, but I think there's a lot of colour and interest in this particular gathering. And then there is something which is much more notable and remarkable, which is that the Queen and Prince Philip come to dine in number 10. So how do these dinners come about, and who gets invited, and what unfolds at them?
So just remembering the calendar, it's Tuesday, the 16th of March, that he's announced his resignation. The first ballot of the Labour leadership contest will be taking place on Thursday, the 25th, so Thursday week after he announces. And so Wilson schedules two big dinners in the interval on Monday, the 22nd, and on Tuesday, the 23rd of March. And Wilson says that he wants to have these two dinners take place before the first ballot because, quote, I don't know how many ballots there will be, and I don't want to give these dinners an fish and chip shop. So it's reference to the unpredictability sometimes of these leadership contests. So the first dinner in Downing Street on Monday, the 22nd of March, as you say, Lee, is for the cabinet. They initially gather in one of the rooms and have champagne. Barbara Castle recalls in her diary, After we chatted for about 20 minutes or so over champagne, the news went round that we were waiting for Shirley Williams, late as usual. She blew in at last, in some rather crumpled white frock she'd been wearing all day, her hair uncombed. I wore a long black velvet dress. As Shirley Williams entered in that rather frazzled style, a great cheer went up from the rest of the cabinet, "Hooray!" which meant that now that everyone was there, they could go and have their dinner. They had dinner in the state dining room in Downing Street, which is, if you've seen pictures of it, it's a sort of wood-panelled room. I think it looks rather oppressive, actually, that room. I mean, I don't even know if it has windows, to be honest. It just looks a bit depressing. Wilson had done the seating arrangements, and he had decided to seat members exactly as they sat round the cabinet table. Barbara Castle didn't like this. She thought that Wilson was playing it safe. "This is just like a cabinet meeting with food," she complained. She said she was disgusted by this. I think this is a little over the top, and I think it might have something to do with the fact that she felt that the men on either side of her were rather boring company. It was Eric Varley, the industry secretary, on one side, and Lord Shepherd, who was the leader of the House of Lords, on the other side. Lord Shepherd, I should say, was a hereditary Labour peer. Now, someone of his likes would be kicked out by the current Labour leadership, but Harold Wilson had no problem with having hereditary peers in his cabinet. First course was salmon with hollandaise sauce. Waiter comes in with the tray. The hollandaise sauce is in one of those sort of serving vessels, trips over and spills the hollandaise sauce all over Dennis Healey, the Chancellor. Healey laughs and laughs it off. I suppose that's really what you have to do in those situations. The second course about to arrive. Bob Mellish, the Chief Whip, says to Eric Varley, "I don't mind what it is as long as it's not duck. Platters arrive, it's duck." Well, I should just say for a moment, just mentioning Bob Mellish and Eric Varley, these men are not really remembered very much today, but they were, of course, big figures, industry secretary, chief whip, but also very working class members of the Wilson cabinet. Both men left school at the age of 14. Bob Mellish worked on the docks and then became a trade union official. Eric Varley worked in an ironworks from the age of 14. Both men became engineers, worked blue-collar jobs before entering politics through the trade union movement. And I just mention them because it still continues to rankle me when Starmer claims to have the most working class cabinet in history, when there's not a single member of his cabinet who didn't go to university, who didn't work a white collar professional job. I mean, anyway, sorry, but it just really annoys me. Ted Short, as deputy leader, says a few words at dinner, not very notable. Harold Wilson gives a speech, also not a very good one. Then Tony Benn gives a speech, and I think it's notable. Ben wasn't sort of scheduled to give a speech. He kind of spontaneously gives a speech, and you got to remember Ben is one of the candidates for the leadership. We'll go through that in our next episode. But this is a very good speech that Ben gives in contrast to Short and Wilson. It's full of humour. Ben begins by revealing that in 1965, he had been approached by journalists and said, "Would you mind writing Harold Wilson's obituary?" Which sounds odd to us, but actually I think it's quite common for newspapers and broadcasters to keep obituaries on file of significant people in case they die suddenly. And Ben then said that he sort of years ago raised this with Harold Wilson and said, "Harold, what would we do if you were suddenly hit by a bus?" And without missing a beat, Harold Wilson said, "Well, find out who was driving the bus." And then, making a reference to the two frontrunners in the campaign, Jim Callaghan, the Foreign Secretary, and Michael Foot, the Employment Secretary, who were both older than Wilson. I think that's worth thinking on. Tony Benn says, "Harold, in a few years' time, there will no doubt be demand for a younger man." And of course, some people think maybe he's making reference to himself. And then Ben says, "So all I hope is that when you stand again for leader, you don't split the left-wing vote." So sort of, making a reference that he and Wilson are the younger men compared to Callaghan and Foote. Roy Jenkins, also a candidate for the leadership, stands up and starts to say a few words, but Barbara Castle, I don't know if she had a bit too much champagne or what was going on, but she starts heckling him and talking over him, and he can't get his words out because she keeps interrupting him. So he just sort of eventually gives up and sits down. And then finally, Elwyn Jones, who was organizing the leadership contest, says a few final words, and then dinner concludes, and they go off and have a few more drinks. And then the following day, there's another dinner at Downing Street, this time, as you mentioned, with the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh. The last time that she came to do a dinner at Downing Street was 21 years earlier for Winston Churchill, when he retired, and she had not returned since. This time, not all of the members of the cabinet were invited. Some of them were, some of them weren't, and this caused some upset because some of the members who had been invited were candidates, and some of the candidates were not invited. So Jim Callaghan, the Foreign Secretary, Michael Foote, the Employment Secretary, Dennis Healey, the Chancellor, and Roy Jenkins, the Home Secretary, were all invited. Tony Crossland, the Environment Secretary, and Tony Benn were not invited, so that was seen as a bit of a snub by Wilson. There were other members of the Cabinet who sort of were notable by their absence. Barbara Castle was not invited to this dinner. Peter Shaw was. It wasn't an entirely Labour gathering, so interestingly, the former Prime Minister, Sir Alec Douglas Hume, now Lord Hume of the Hersal, and his wife, Lady Hume, were both present at the dinner. But beyond that, I can't see too many. I don't think there were other former Prime Ministers there. I don't think there were that many Tories there, so it's sort of interesting that they were invited. Apparently, the Queen had a whale of a time at the opening drinks. They were 45 minutes late for the pre-dinner photograph they were all meant to take because the Queen was talking so much and apparently laughing quite a lot. And then after dinner, the Queen stayed late for the drinks post-dinner. Apparently she was talking to Michael Foote for a very long time. The view was no one could leave before the Queen, so even people who had stuff to do the next day and were feeling quite tired, they all had to wait there until the Queen finally decided it was time for her to go back to Buckingham Palace.
So, Richard, in the next episode, we're going to look at what I think is probably, or certainly quite possibly, the highest quality leadership election of the post-war era, and it's the battle to replace Harold Wilson as Prime Minister. But before we come on to that, I just want to wrap this episode up by thinking about whether or not what Wilson did in resigning in 1976 was a good way to go. I've got a couple of thoughts on it, but first, what do you think?
I think this is one of the best executed resignations of a prime minister in history, to be honest with you. I think Wilson probably could have stayed on until the end of that parliament if he wished to. So he could have been prime minister until 1979. He would have done 11 years as prime minister. So, in fact, if he'd gone the whole parliament, I think he would have just beaten Margaret Thatcher's later record. However, I would say with one important caveat to that I think the fact that Wilson had been telling his senior ministers in the 1970s, early 1970s, that he wasn't going to do the full parliament helped to insulate him from leadership challenges. And one could think that if he hadn't said that or wasn't planning to retire early, that he might have invited, let's say, a leadership challenge against him in October of 1978, for example. And he might then have left in the way that Thatcher did, which was not by his own choosing, but by his ambitious cabinet ministers forcing him out. So I think the fact that it never came to that because he jumped before he pushed is something that speaks very well to his political skills. And Harold Wilson, I think, is one of the most politically skillful prime ministers we've had. I think that's particularly important for being a Labour Party prime minister. And it is, of course, one of the very enormous skill sets that Keir Starmer seems to completely lack.
If I had a bit of caveat to that, then you're certainly right to say that he wasn't forced out of the door, and that is a big tick in his box compared to most post-war prime ministers. But on this idea of did his political life end in failure, to use the old phrase, well, he left office exhausted, I think, from the demands of office. I don't say that unkindly. I think it was just a matter of fact statement. At the time and immediately afterwards, his reputation, in fact, tanks. So we've spoken in the past about resignation honours. The lavender list, which follows his resignation, is deeply controversial, does him enormous harm. Shortly thereafterwards, Joe Haynes, who you've mentioned as his press secretary, writes a book in which the workings of the Wilson Downing Street are exposed as being really quite dysfunctional, particularly the role of Marcy Williams and her relationship with the Prime Minister. And this is something we mentioned in a bonus episode, actually, about Heath and Wilson. Within 5 years, much of the political economy that he believed in throughout most of his political life was beginning to be dismantled by a prime minister in Margaret Thatcher, who was Wilson was the first person that she was up against at prime minister's questions. And she would ultimately become a figure who dominates post-war British politics more than Wilson and certainly more than Heath, her predecessor. So I think, yes, this particular moment of going out with a smile and a gracious wave rather than being bundled out the back door is a positive one for Wilson. But I think it is actually a bit of an exception to a political career that was fumbling at its end. And with hindsight, the value of which is rather harder to discern. We finish as ever by talking about the books that we're reading at the moment. Richard, why don't you kick us off?
I've recently read How Not to Be an MP's Wife by Sarah Vine. Now, I know you reviewed this book, Lee, on this podcast a few months ago, and I've gotten around now to reading the book myself. What I would say in favor of this book is that Sarah Vine is a very good writer. It's an easy read in the sense that she draws you in, she writes vividly, engagingly, and rather intimately, and so you want to keep turning the pages. Beyond that, though, I have several criticisms of this book. First of all, I actually think it's far too indiscreet. There was a lot of the time when I was reading this book, and I'm thinking, do we really need to know all of this? She's very indiscreet. She's very revealing of her own insecurities. Okay, that's, I suppose, fine being an honest writer. I'm not sure that I needed to know all of that, but it's her choice as a writer. But she's very indiscreet about the private lives of her parents, her children, her ex-husband, Michael Gove, her friends, their children. And in that respect, I think she's also quite hypocritical because she constantly complains in the book about invasions of privacy, but then she's actually really quite revealing about many of these people's private lives. In general, I found that she seemed completely status obsessed, yet blind to her own privilege. She constantly sort of gives this impression that she's a sort of hard done by, hard scrabble type individual. Yet clearly she comes from a very privileged background. She lives a very privileged life. She talks about how she lives in these scruffy homes. Well, I mean, she gives the address of her home in the book, which again is like, do we need to know that? But being a bit nosy, I looked it up and, they paid £2 million for that house. I mean, I don't think that's a sort of scruffy home. I mean, I'll never live in a £2 million house. And it's, just generally speaking, I found there were a lot of unattractive characteristics that came out in that book. I think the other thing that just sort of struck me was an absence of any real reflection on political ideas, principles, political values, morals, what drives her, what is her worldview. That didn't come out at all. Her worldview just seemed to be about having a nice time with friends and being recognized by famous people. And I suppose that's fine. I mean, she isn't a politician, but she was a prominent journalist. But it just all struck me as rather vacuous. So I'm sorry to say, this is not a book that I will be recommending to our readers, unless you're a very nosy person like me. Lee, what is your book this week?
Well, I just started reading Gordon Brown, Power with Purpose by James McIntyre. Now, this is a book that I wanted to read for a couple of reasons. The first being that Gordon Brown is undoubtedly one of the weightiest figures on the British left for the last 30, 40 years. He, of course, had a remarkable career on the Labour frontbench in opposition, and then, of course, his decade as Chancellor and 3 years as a Prime Minister. But the reason why I actually wanted to read this book wasn't to relearn those points, but it's to really see what the author's reflection is on Brown in his post-prime ministerial years. Both Blair and Brown have had very interesting times, I think, since they left office. Blair's, of course, is very grand. It's very institutional. The Tony Blair Institute for Global Change, that produces lots of reports. He does consultancy work for governments around the world. In Brown's case, it's been much more modest, I think, the ways in which he sought to influence politics afterwards. But arguably, it's been more consequential. One of the rather cliched examples of that is the way in which Gordon Brown gave a blockbuster speech towards the end of the 2014 Scottish independence referendum campaign, which was seen as winning quite a few people over. But there are other ways as well. You can look at interventions he's made around the two-child benefit cap, which the government has now lifted. You can see the way in which Keir Starmer has asked him to do quite a bit of the legwork in some policy areas. Not that that work has necessarily been followed through, but Gordon Brown did a big and dangerously flawed review of the British Constitution, for example. And actually, when you look at some of the people who are around the cabinet table, including in very senior roles, at the moment, they're really more Brownites than Blairites. And we sometimes think about, oh, the Keir Starmer leadership is just trying to rehearse the Blairite playbook. But that's because we think of the Blairite playbook as being about an election-winning exercise and an attempt to try and position the party to do that. If we think of it more in terms of as a governing exercise, then I think in terms of personnel and some of the ideas, we could actually see this as being quite a Brownite government, which is particularly with people like Yvette Cooper, very much a Brownite, Ed Miliband, very much a Brownite, and some of the others as well. So that's really the reason why I picked up this book. I'm not actually at that stage of it yet as it happens, looking at his post-premiership, as this starts rather conventionally with his early life in Scotland, in Fife, and looks at him going through Edinburgh and getting into politics. But it's worth, I think, having a new biography about Gordon Brown, and so far, this is one that I'm enjoying. We'll have links to the chosen books in our show notes, but that's all for this episode of Since Attlee and Churchill. We'll be back on Thursday with our next midweek Matters of Interest, and then on Sunday, when we'll turn to the second half of this story, the race to replace Harold Wilson. We'll see you then.
Thanks very much.